Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. My name is Kim Ponzio and I'm the current president of SWS, and I will be moderating today's webinar. And just a reminder, these webinars are open to SWS members only, and they are one of the ways we are trying to enhance your membership with what I like to call e-participation. The webinars were developed to facilitate the exchange of scientific, management, and policy information concerning wetlands in electronic format, and to enable regular exchange across a wide geographic area in a relatively low-cost, interactive, and multimedia way. And even the members who can't attend today in person will have access to the recorded webinars, and they can watch them on demand. The general format of the webinar will be a 40 to 45-minute presentation by our speaker, followed by approximately 15 minutes of questions for the participants. And also, please be aware that we will announce the next webinar at the end of this session, and we are generally following a monthly schedule. Okay, next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping announcements. Just to familiarize you with the GoToMeeting screens, there is an attendee control panel where you can control the audio for the webinar. You can use audio through your computer or your telephone, and you can consult the directions in the audio pane on how to do that. And at any time during the presentation, if you think of a question, you can type it into the questions pane. And as the moderator during the question and answer period, I will read the questions to the presenter so that everyone can hear the questions clearly. Also located in the handout section, you'll find a copy of today's webinar presentation in a PDF format. So you can feel free to save that copy for future use. And I want to note that all the attendee phone lines are on mute to cut out background noises and distractions. And the webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to that recording following the webinar. And we also ask you to take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar, so we can plan future events and kind of gauge the types of topics that you would like to hear about. And I always say, if you're really tech savvy and you know how to tweet, you can tweet about today's webinar using the hashtag SWS webinar. So with the logistics out of the way, let's get started with our webinar. It's my pleasure to welcome today's presenter, Dr. Beth Middleton. Beth is a research ecologist with the Wetlands and Aquatic Research Center with the U.S. Geological Survey in Lafayette, Louisiana. Her research focuses on how drought may change wetlands across large geographical areas. Her most recent studies are on hydrologic remediation and vegetation response, and she applies those findings to natural resource conservation. Her work has contributed to the understanding of world wetland restoration and global climate change, and her book entitled Wetland Restoration, Flood Pulsing, and Disturbance Dynamics received the Merit Award of the Society of Wetland Scientists. Her dissertation was on monsoonal wetlands in India, earning a PhD from Iowa State University, and was the origin of her later research on the implications of shifts in drought cycles on wetland biodiversity. She is a member of the graduate faculty at the University of Louisiana, and before moving to USGS, she was a full professor at Southern Illinois University. She has done research on all continents except Antarctica, and most recently has served as a senior visiting professor with the Chinese Academy of Science, working on wetland dynamics in China. Welcome, Dr. Middleton.
Okay, thanks, Kim. I really appreciate the opportunity to do a webinar in this way, and I really have to thank the people at the business office, Michelle and Allison and others, for making this opportunity available through webinars. It's really an exciting new development, I think. So I'm going to today talk about our prospects as wetland restorationists and managers for conservation in our looming future of climate change. And okay, I can't change the slide. So next slide. And, all right. So some of the challenges that we have ahead for wetland restoration and management are next, that there is, we need to know more about how this climate is changing next, and we have a real need for the regional data. As restoration and management people, we need to start rethinking some of our goals for restoration and management, and whether or not we can do things in the way and for the reasons that we used to do. We need to start looking at the relative weights of land use change versus climate change, and what we can attribute to what, and how changing some of those things might actually contribute to conservation. We also need to start thinking more interdisciplinarily, and this is the broad framework for what I'm going to be talking about in this talk today. So next slide. All right, first a bit, and if you could push it again, please. Next, there we go. Okay. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is an international organization of scientists who are doing climate models and projections on what we can expect for climate change in the future. And there are some specifics there about wetlands, but really not as much as we really need for management. But some of the things that they're talking about are that, for example, with climate change, drought in particular, humans are going to be using more fresh water. That will, of course, impact wetlands because there will be less water available. There will be more droughts and flooding because the temperatures and precipitation changes will occur. Storm intensity is likely to become more intense in the future, and we can also expect that as the polar ice melts, that we'll have sea level rise and more saltwater intrusion in the future. So all of these things have the potential of affecting wetlands, and I want to talk a little bit about what we know about that. So next.
Try advancing now, Beth.
Okay, I'm trying left click. Oh, did I do that?
You did. Yeah.
Good. All right. There we go. Thanks a lot. All right, so the world outlook for wetlands is the outlook for the world, which is that it's going to become hotter according to the model projections. But the part about how much rain a particular area is going to get and how evaporation will be affected by the temperatures are really pretty critical, and that very much varies regionally around the world. So for example, in North India, where Kim mentioned that I worked for a time when I was working on my PhD dissertation, there it's predicted to be hotter but wetter. And so the IPCC and the National Center for Medium Range Forecasting, which is an Indian organization, are all predicting that there will be more rain in the future, but that's only sometimes. Other times there will be more intense droughts, so that we can expect that there will be more flooding in wetlands and also more intense droughts, and that will certainly affect the conservation of those areas. I'm pushing forward again. Oh, there we go. I have to push harder. Okay, in South Australia, the prediction is actually fairly similar to that of the central and southwestern United States, in that it's expected to be hotter there, but drier, and there is going to be predicted to be less rain in the future. And for the central U.S., it's predicted that there may be as much as 30% less rain, and so droughts are predicted. And there is a new paper that's come out by Cook. That group of researchers works for NASA. This has come out in Science, and they are predicting that with the climate change going the direction it is right now, that there may be mega droughts by the year 2050. And these mega droughts are really going to be quite a problem for wetlands. And if you think about a mega drought lasting for 30 years, this is really going to have a serious impact on our central United States wetlands. And the prospect of having little water for 30 years is really something that's going to spell, great doom for the conservation of these areas. So I'm hoping that we can keep that from happening at all. But what might survive in a wetland with 30 years of drought is probably very little. Perhaps some seeds can survive in the seed bank, but some of the studies that we have done show that the seed banks are not particularly resilient to even very short-term droughts. The IPCC has also done, I'm pushing it too hard and too long. They have also done a review of the studies that have been done around the world and are showing that climate change impacts are already quite common in various places. This is not just for wetlands, but it's for water resources, agricultural resources, fishing resources, and there are many reports of climate change already affecting areas around the world, and so that's something that we should be aware of in talking about this subject today. And I also gave an Earth Day talk last year, and someone at the end of the talk said to me, well, climate change is really inevitable, so why should we talk about this at all? And that is a very glum outlook. I think that there are many things that we can do to try to avoid some of these changes to occur in the future. And the changes that may occur, maybe we can deal with them in a very good way and continue to conserve our natural resources. So I would like to talk today about some of the things that we might be able to do. I think some of the things that we need as conservationists are more information about what we might expect in a local area. And some of those projections are beginning to emerge. So for example, there was this new study also out in Nature Geosciences recently that looks at the water flooding changes in the Midwestern United States during the last 50 years. Now this is a very useful study because it shows that this one region, which is the Midwest, is not at the present time experiencing the same tendencies to flooding across this area. So for example, in areas around Chicago and Indiana, for example, the flooding is increasing in the last 50 years, but in the western part of this region, say Kansas, the flood levels are decreasing, and the flood magnitudes and frequencies. So this is well worth knowing as a manager, because if you're talking into the near future, you want to know, well, are these areas likely to flood? Are they likely not to flood? How high do I, or how well do I need to make structures to contain water? I mean, this is really very critical information for doing conservation work, dealing with water in the future. So I think another thing we need to consider is, what are our goals in conservation? And in the past, I think the goal has often been to try to recreate pre-settlement conditions with the idea that the species would be adapted to those conditions if they were present a long time ago in the historical past. And I think climates are changing now, and we need to think more in terms of what kind of suitable habitats can we maintain for species given the environments that we have. And I put this little note in there about the old controversy about what the pre-settlement concept actually means anyway, but probably most of you have gone through those arguments in the past. But we need to think now about, well, what can our goal be? And can we maintain suitable habitats, and if so, for what in particular regions and local areas? And that brings us to the sad point of talking about the 19th century naturalists, especially John Muir, and their setting up of the national parks as areas that would experience less land use change, and so therefore conserve and protect species. I think we're rapidly moving beyond the point now where we can expect those environments to be able to maintain species because of the global changes in temperature and associated changes that go along with that. So I realize that moving on from the pre-settlement concept is something that a lot of people don't really want to let go of. I probably would include myself, but I think the environments have now moved beyond the point where we can really sustain that, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that in a minute. But I think we need to develop a more pragmatic approach to really avoid species and ecosystem loss in the near future. So what's happening in our most natural areas? For example, the national parks. We've already reached a situation where the historical habitats are no longer available because the environments have changed so much. And the Society of Ecological Restoration has a great definition, I think, that can actually help guide us in the future, is that when we're restoring areas, we may want to think about establishing or maintaining a function in biodiversity that is useful for the species that we are trying to conserve. And so that's a way forward for us. It's a kind of a departure in the thinking of the past. But let's talk a little bit about what's happening to the national parks in the last 100 years. The temperatures in the national parks across North America, anyway, are now at the upper end of the temperatures in all categories. So the annual mean, the minimum coldest month temperature, all of these things are at the upper end that they've been recorded before. And precipitation is now much more variable. And so these are recorded changes now. Fossil Islands National Lakeshore, which is a national park that is very close to my heart since I worked there for several summers, is now at the 100th percentile of the warmest temperatures ever recorded. So we no longer have the environments in these places that we once did. So a retrospective goal of maintaining pre-settlement conditions is really not possible anymore. So some projections looking at what we have now and whether or not those are suitable habitats for species, and with a look toward what may happen in the future with projected climate changes, can be seen in papers like one by Fisicelli. And what he's done is to look at sets of species in national parks. So those are the rows. This is Voyageurs, here's Acadiana. And then what we have across in the columns are sets of species that are maintained in the current climate. So for example, Picea mariana in Voyageurs National Park is present there now, starting in 1990. Projecting into the future, the habitat suitability is decreasing in this model toward the year 2100, and probably to the point where this species may not be able to be maintained. There are some species that are less certain, those are in the middle, but clear winners in this are species that are finding themselves in a suitable habitat as projected by these models. So by the year 2100, Voyageurs National Park has a climate environment which is very nice for Acer rubrum, which I know managers won't like to hear that, but that is a species that's likely to be able to survive the climates there in the future. So I think this is instructive. We should take a look at models like this to, as managers and restorationists, to get an idea of what we may be able to sustain in the future in these areas. So the temperatures are changing, the climates are changing, but I think it's important to remember that a lot of our conservation threats have to do actually with land use changes. And these two things combined together actually are the things that threaten the ecosystems and species as much as anything. And so if we can do something with one, for example, land use change, we may be able to actually address especially short-term problems as climates change. And a paper by Parmesan points out that the land use changes are probably more important than the temperatures in the biogeographic distribution of species anyway, and so it's important for us to keep that in mind, that land use change is a big player in this. And as an example of this, if we look at a review paper by Dubois looking at land use changes along the lower Mississippi River, he points out that the hydrology along the Mississippi River is so different from how it was in pre-settlement times. There are levees built all across the up and down the Mississippi River. There's many of the wetlands on the floodplain no longer have any flood pulsing from the river. There's obstructions everywhere. There's channel straightening, there's channel deepening or for navigation. There's much pollution, urban development. There's cities that block the flow of species across this area. This is really a massively changed landscape, and I think one of the views to the future is that in some cases we may be able to just deal with some of the land use change problems and actually address at least some of the short-term problems with climate change. So, flood pulsing, many of the species along the rivers need moving water. We often don't have the proper water delivery system. We have maybe standing, blocked water, but we don't necessarily have moving, flowing water. So it's very different. And I think if we want to talk about restoration in particular, we need to start thinking about what is impacting our ability to conserve biodiversity, and it's the emerging functions of wetlands and their wetland services. What are the things that are really causing these changes? And so there are changes to water quality and water delivery that we can address to try to help improve the situation and the settings for our conservation areas. And just as an example of how this all fits together, for example, from the perspective of water quality, there are salinity changes, particularly along the coast, mostly due to sea level rise, which we could ascribe to climate change. But there are a number of other changes that have to do with excessive nutrient inputs, more sediments, pollutants from industries. And these are all impacting the water quality, and it's a combination of human land use change and climate change that are affecting the conservation of our areas. And so I think we need to conceptualize it together, both land use change and climate change. And I think there are, that's my favorite slide. Okay, because I'm going to talk about my own research for a minute here. I think we have, we need more information about how species and ecosystems work, and we have surprisingly little information, especially in the field, about how the function of our ecosystems changes across large geographical gradients. And my long-term study in bald cypress swamps is set up in order to deal with that. But the idea of this is, for example, we might look at what the situation is for the hydrology and climate change in places like the southwestern part of the range of the bald cypress, and we might then project what might happen to the bald cypress ecosystem further northward with climate change, because we already know how they're responding to those climates in the southwest. So I think it's instructive. It's not the complete answer, but it tells us something about climate change in the future. Another thing I think we can do is take a look at some places where climate change in conjunction with water extraction have already impacted the biodiversity of our wetlands. And I have two case examples for you, and they come from research that I've done. One is to do with India, which is a wetlands that I worked when I was working on my PhD dissertation, and the other has to do with cypress swamps that I now work on in Texas. And so first I'm going to talk about the situation in India. When I was working in India in the 1980s, I was working in flooded floating wetlands, And during that time, there was a discharge coming from the river into these national parks, flooding the areas on this delta. And the precipitation levels were always dramatically different from year to year because it's a monsoonal wetland. And the precipitation in this area hasn't changed all that much. It possibly has gone up a little bit. But the water extraction along that river changed drastically in the 1990s, and so that the discharge coming into the national park was reduced greatly, so that by the year 2000 there was really very little water coming into the national park through discharge from the river. In 2009, there was a fairly good monsoon, and the national park actually reflooded a bit. And the floating wetlands didn't exactly reemerge. This is what it looked like during the 1980s, and I guess it probably doesn't look like this. When you'd walk through it, it would be, this area would probably be about chest deep in the water, but it hasn't been that flooded now for quite a long time. And so what happened in 2009 was there was some reflooding, and aquatic plants began to reemerge, and people that I used to work with contacted me and asked me if I would come back and help them look for some species that they had been considered to be missing for a while, the aquatic plants. Okay, let me see, I'm pushing too hard. Some of the aquatic plants had more or less disappeared for a period of time during the long drought. And so there was a list of 25 or more species that were really quite rare and species of concern. So I went back, and this was actually just a couple of day survey, and we walked along areas where we knew that seed banks of these species had existed in the 1980s, a likely place to look for them because species might be stored in seed banks during droughts. I mean, that's a logical thing, and something that gives me some hope for the future that seed banks can survive periods of drought. And lo and behold, when we did this, we found all but 3 or 4 of the species. But what was really surprising was that of these dominant species, so many of them were actually fairly hard to find in 2009. Another thing that happened was that shortly after that, the Indian government reconnected another river so that fresh water again came into this national park, which is something to remember. Wetlands need water, and I think hydrologic remediation is a good idea about how to approach problems like this. So diverting fresh water and also decreasing extraction if possible is one of the ways forward with climate change and land use change in the future. The second example I want to talk about is in Beaumont, Texas. And in that area, there has been many dams and much water extraction that has occurred along the river. And so there was a major drought in 2011 and in 2012, so that the salinity levels in tidal freshwater swamps became quite high. 46 parts per thousand may not sound high to you if you are a marine or a coastal person working in non-freshwater areas, but that's quite high for bald cypress swamps. And the trees began to die. And in 2012, we went out and did a survey of the dead trees and also came up with a way of scoring trees to look at how stressed we thought they might be. You can see this tree has lost its bark, and when a tree, and we all know, if you have a tree that's losing its bark in your yard, it's probably on its way out. And that's, one of the things that we felt was that this tree was probably going to die. But we found trees that were, as I would say, really and completely dead, and they were the younger trees that were less than 10 meters tall. There was a large number of them that was died. So this regeneration category almost disappeared during this drought, and even some of the larger trees died. So that, I think, is a harbinger of the future. I think when you have forests that are already stressed for some reason, and then you get a drought, that is definitely going to impact them. And I think a new concept maybe it's not so new, but a concept that speaks to us in this situation is the idea of relic forests, relic vegetation in wetlands. We can detect our places where the adults are no longer really regenerating, or very rarely. And it's seed germination and a cohort of regenerating individuals is necessary for the long-term survival of vegetation. And when you get a disturbance come along, it may just, like a drought, for example, or hurricane, it may just completely eliminate the adult vegetation and then cause the area to shift to a different type. So I think in the future of climate change, we're going to see that relic status is something that should be our first clue that we need to start working on climate or well, especially land use change possibilities. Maybe we can restore the hydrology, and maybe that could help. And I think also in the climate change debate, water regime is more important than temperature. Temperature is an important thing, but I think we learn in our wetland ecology classes that there's a certain component of species that emerge when it's not flooded, but there's plenty of moisture around, and then there's another set of species that emerge when it is flooded. And I think it's largely these dynamics of the life history of the species to water regime that is really going to determine the emerging species in our future conservation areas. So the climate change and its ability to alter the drawdown and flooding patterns are what's going to be that's driving at least the short-term vegetation changes. And as that changes, the biodiversity and ecosystem function of these areas will change. So the plan, what is our plan? Well, I don't think we have what you'd call a concrete plan for what to do about the future, but there's some very interesting things that I have seen in very recent times about things that we might be able to do. And one neat idea comes from Larry Allen, who is a researcher at our center in Lafayette, Louisiana. And he is talking about the importance of creating pollinator refugio. So these are isolated areas, for example, on the edges or even quite apart from agricultural areas. So for example, grazing lands in wet prairies that can be managed to try to maintain the largest number of flowering plants possible for the purposes of maintaining our wild pollinators. So that's a pretty neat idea, and I think something that we should be giving some thought to, a landscape ecology sort of idea. Another thing that is talking about the benefits of geographical isolation comes up when we start talking about certain species like Typholatifolia and Phragmites. There are native populations of these species. You probably know that Typha and Phragmites have now, most of these populations have genes that have come in from Eurasia and have changed their ecology and behavior. But there are still populations here and there on islands or just because of their geographical isolation that may maintain some of this genetic integrity for these species. And we need to try to protect those populations. And mostly when we start talking about climate change, we talk about the importance of connectivity, and that is an important thing because species might be able to move northward or away from whatever the climate stresses are on their own. If we can maintain migration routes, okay, I'm thinking a good model for this is the Mississippi River alluvial valley. We might be able to have species move northward. But there are some problems. Species, at least plant species, that are dispersed hydrologically, are floating in the water, really don't move northward very readily because along the Mississippi River, the current is southward, and so that's not so likely to happen. But one of the things is, too, there are a lot of local barriers for species trying to move away from their current place. And so, for example, if they could get themselves northward, will they be able to move across the levees and the dams, and can they move out of the channel at all with all of the channel down cutting? And these local barriers are something I think that we can do something about in terms of climate change. We can address that. There are also cities. It's hard for species to move around cities and urban development, and in coastal environments with sea level rise and the additional flooding and the additional salinity, many of the freshwater species, for example, are finding themselves in environments where the salinity is now too high, and you know, it's questionable as to whether or not they move. Now this is a complicated question, but you know, will they be able to move easily out of those areas with salinity? So those are some of the impacts. The species being able to move on their own is definitely difficult with all of these barriers to having that movement occur. So I think these are things that we can address. These are basically land use questions. Another thing that has to do with connecting migration pathways has to do with the idea of reconnecting rivers that may have been disconnected. And there are waterways. I have in mind one that's in southern Illinois. This hasn't been connected, but there's been some talk about reconnecting an old river. And this would be of value for species trying to move northward, for example, during climate change, if they could actually move northward from the southern part of this river. Also, the other interesting thing about this is that by maintaining these moist areas along the river, these might also be very useful during climate change if that particular area might stay wet, for example. And so the idea of maintaining and very carefully conserving moist refugia, even though they may be dry for a lot of the time, may be important in maintaining some of our species in the future, because that may be the only place that these species have that they can still survive. And I put the picture of India back in here because I think that this moist refugia idea is more or less one of the reasons that the species were maintained there, you know, during some of these drought times. So I think it's an interesting idea, and one that just because an area is dry doesn't mean that it may no longer have wetland conservation attributes. So we need to think about that in the future. All right. Another important idea is the idea of actually providing fresh water during times when species may be stressed. And this has to do with a study that I did when the diversions for the Mississippi River were opened up after the oil spill. And what I found in that study was that if the fresh water increased and the salinity decreased in my study areas, that there was a 3 times increase in the production. These areas were really not exactly what I would call stressed, but the salinity levels decreased and they started to grow much better after that. Another study that I think speaks to this idea of hydrologic remediation even better was one that was done in Australia on eucalyptus, and there was a long-term drought there in after 2000, and the Australians released fresh water into these eucalyptus forests to try to revive the forest. And what happened was very interesting. The trees that were stressed but not so damaged actually revived and grew very well after that. So, and I think this speaks to the idea that with climate change we might actually be able to have scheduled freshwater releases if we can just get the water to keep things alive. The other thing they found was that if the trees were too stressed and they were already very damaged, they didn't respond as well to the fresh water at all. So it's important to do it in time. Another idea that is quite controversial is the idea of assisted migration, and this I think is something that is a good discussion point for people working in restoration. Is it really ethical to move species in the south of North America, for example, to the north, to get them to, if they can't move on their own, can we just move them to places where the environments and the climates are more suitable for them? But there is the debate about whether or not we are introducing species that are not really native or natural to the north in these kinds of situations. And I think we need to start having the discussion about this. But certainly we can just do it as kind of a restoration sort of thing where we put these southern species into a truck and move them northward. And I think that might be one way we have of keeping some things alive. And these problems that I've been discussing, I mean, as you can see, some of these ideas are, you know, not 100% certain to work, but I think they are, at their heart, very interdisciplinary. They're very complex, and I think most of us have very specific training, and I think we need to start to think more interdisciplinarily. We need to learn how to talk to one another about what we know and what we know well, and then talk and be able to talk and listen to people about how they may have ideas to come up with problems. And I think the people that need to come and talk are not just ecologists and biologists, but also people who know ethics, physics, climate, sociology. I mean, I think almost anyone could bring good skills to these discussions, but these are complex situations. I think we need to start coming up with some really good ideas about what to do, and I think that's what it's going to take. I think probably we need more interdisciplinary training. I think a lot of people are coming out of the universities these days with better interdisciplinary training, but I'd also like to say that I think people also need a very deep and core training in something so that they really understand some particular area very completely. And it's very necessary that we start to think about these questions geographically, even if we're working locally. And these problems are also bleeding over into agencies and how they're set up and how they're thinking. There's a lot of conflicts in the way, well, not so much conflicts, but differences in approaches to the various agencies. And I think that sometimes it makes it difficult for the agencies to really talk about similar goals when they're having to do with climate and land use, when their goals that have set them up in the first place are so different. So it's an interesting thing that I've seen come out are the ideas of the joint ventures. These, I think probably most of you know about this, have set up sometimes offices that where the people work in the same places, and they interact then more often and are, you know, creating dialogues about how to move forward. So all of those things I think are important. But I think there's a few things that you should remember from this talk, and that one thing is that, at least I think, that pre-settlement conditions are now unsustainable. We have the horse has left the barn. I don't think that we can really maintain those things, habitats anymore in that way. Although I think that it is important to remember the life history setting and what species are adapted to, which is related to this pre-settlement condition. I think that can be our guiding light in what we may be able to do in the future to preserve them. So what's the future of restoration and management? Well, I think we have real threats in wetlands. Climate change is, for the most part, going to alter hydrology, and the human demands for fresh water are going to make it harder and harder for us to have water to actually conserve our areas. So what are some of the solutions? Well, we need, you know, I haven't talked really about this, but we really need to reduce carbon emissions. According to the President's Climate Action Plan, if and I got this from Bill Mumma during the SWS meeting this year actually, but if we were to reduce our carbon emissions by 80%, we could actually, this is kind of glum, we could only keep the temperatures from rising any more than they already have. So that's not such good news, but at least it's a target value. And I think we also need to reduce human disturbance. And I think that is something that we can approach more readily. We can reduce the stresses in our conservation areas by reducing some of these land use changes. We can repair the flood pulsing and water dynamics of the areas. I think in many ways that is the most important aspect of the threats to our conservation areas. And I think we need to think about what kinds of habitats we can really maintain given the life history dynamics of the species that are our target species for those areas. So with that, oh, you don't need to see that unless you really want to look into that. But with that, that's what I have today. And so I'll ask Kim if she's gotten any questions. So thanks, everyone, for listening to this webinar. It's kind of strange not being able to see you, but I enjoyed it nonetheless.
Thank you, Beth. I'm really interested and motivated to think about how my perspective has changed a little bit about thinking about pre-settlement conditions. And I think we always think of restoration as being that, you know, return to the pre-settlement conditions. So we've got this new paradigm, especially now with other components to it, like climate change, that we're going to have to think about. So I know you got me thinking. I have a couple questions of my own, but I'll start with one of those. I just want to let people know if you're wanting to ask a question, just go ahead and type it into the questions box, and I will read those to Beth in the order that I received them. So go ahead and submit some of those questions. So Beth, if you're ready, I'll go ahead and ask the first question. Okay, so this one is a little bit more of a something to think about, and maybe you can just address it. It wasn't a question per se. It says, while temperature may be trumped by hydrology, the lengthening of the growing season could result in an increased period of evapotranspiration. So plants will senesce later, and I would think that would alter water levels. And here in the northeastern United States, water levels are higher now, primarily as plants are not as active as they were in the summer. So can you address that, what you think is going to happen?
Oh, that's interesting. So because of the phenology, the species are senescing anyway, but the water levels are higher and they're not evapotranspirating as much. That's an interesting point. Wow, cool. Okay, no, I hadn't thought about that. But I mean, I totally agree with the point that the temperatures and the precipitation and the evaporation and the evapotranspiration all go together to determine how much water that you have. And you know, that is the heart of it. And I think for any particular region, or especially any area within that region, it's very much a matter of how that all fits together as to what the flood levels will be in a particular wetland at a particular time. And yeah, that really speaks to it, and that's why I think these models are very important. That the study that I was showing that had to do with the flooding in the Midwest, I think is one that really kind of begins to speak to that. You know, what are we getting in terms of flooding? You know, how is that changing now? How will that change in the near future? Those are the sorts of things that we really need to know for planning. And I think it isn't surprising in a way that we don't have a good plan, because we often don't have a good feel for what's going to happen in our specific area, because it's so complicated by things like, for example, in the Northeast, you're getting more rain. In the area around Chicago, you're getting more rain, but other places are not. So yeah, okay.
Thanks, Beth. I have a follow-on to that. Now, some of the things that we're seeing with decreased water levels, invasion of shrubs that transpire more water. However, and maybe you can talk about this, they also sequester more carbon because they're putting a lot into their woody tissues and things like that. So that actually could reduce, the carbon output to the atmosphere, maybe even having to do with carbon dioxide and methane. So I wondered if you knew anything about that, if you could comment.
Well, wow, there's a lot to that question too. There is the one part of the discussion is that CO2 levels may be increasing the size and density of the shrubs, and then the other thought about it is that it has to do with differences in cattle grazing or differences in fire intensity. I mean, the reasons that shrubs may be growing at different levels are it's a matter of some controversy, but how this changes the carbon sequestration part of it is, I guess also based on the discussion of, why they're growing more. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's a complicated little piece of the question too.
Right. Okay. Well, this is another one. It says, returning to the use of wetlands as natural infrastructure in urban areas would seem to be a good idea for helping species migration and creating more moist areas for seed banks. Mm-hmm. It's more of a statement. Did you want to address that?
Sure. I think that having wetland areas along in urban areas, could potentially do that. I know too that in urban areas, often the wetland areas don't have the extent of the floodplain necessary, and so perhaps people who work in urban ecology might think about their areas as being part of a corridor for species moving northward or moving elsewhere, and that trying to actually restore or maintain their areas in ways that would improve that is a good idea, because I think often what we have now in urban areas are places that often really are not so designed for restoration, but more designed to be a park or a just simply an area where there isn't any development, and maybe it's not even a good area for flood storage. So sometimes the goals in an urban area are not specifically to create a migration route, but if there was more thought given to that, that could be very useful.
And I think this is something that this next question or comment is something that might speak to that, because if you're going to be doing these natural infrastructure or these natural corridors in urban areas, it's going to have to go into some bigger planning, and also there's going to need to be money involved. And the next person asks, or says, as part of the interdisciplinary discussions, that needs to include economics. Restoration needs to be funded and valued.
Okay, that sounds like a good statement to me.
Yeah, I think that's something where we need to make sure that we are keeping learning how to communicate the science to, economists and other groups of people that will be involved in trying to make these things happen. So the next one is, please discuss the ideas of restoration through gardening versus goals of maintaining the healthiest function possible given changing conditions under climate change.
Oh, well, I guess when you have a garden setting, you may be maintaining species, but you may not necessarily be maintaining the function of an entire ecosystem. So the main thing that I can think of that has to do with the benefits of a garden setting is that you may just be keeping species alive at all. And sometimes when you, and I do a lot of traveling, and sometimes I see species in parts of Asia or whatever that are in a garden. Sometimes I think sometimes the point of it may be just to keep those species alive in a place that's very developed. And I mean, I like to see that, but I don't really think necessarily creates those functions.
Right. So I may have not read everything into that one. I think gardening it's in quotation, meaning if you're assisting maybe migration.
I see. So so assisted migration does become something of a gardening exercise. Yeah, I see. Yeah, and that's one of its criticisms as well. I just see that if we really lose the ability to do anything else, that assisted migration may be a way to keep these species alive into the future. I don't see this as my a way of dealing with climate change that's going to make anyone really happy in the future. But I would if it gets really bad, I mean, like the 30-year drought, I mean, maybe it's the best thing that we can do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's another comment. I worry about remaining wetlands being used to cover, quote unquote, for all the missing wetland functions in a landscape. For example, adding ponds to wet meadows.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, I think maybe that comment is coming from the idea that maybe we want to keep things as natural as possible, so that they're functioning on their own without our changing them into a pond or something that some people might find more aesthetically pleasing. I really share that perspective, and I've always been kind of a pre-settlement condition kind of person into the near past. But I just reading the literature, I feel that we need to start thinking about what we can do in the future. And I at least if I see the point of that comment, I think we don't really just want to be creating pretty areas. It would be nice if we could actually maintain ecosystems that are functioning in the way they are now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, actually somebody is asking for you to show the list of citations again, but I would direct them to get the PDF because it's on your PDF on the handout section. So if you want to go ahead and copy that to the person who wanted to see those citations. I have one last question because we're getting close to the end of the time here, and that is, what about the quote-unquote novel ecosystems, and maybe actually these things happening where you're getting migration or lack of migration might actually increase biodiversity, because as we talked about earlier, it may change some function, but what I was wondering too is how do we start to identify the species that are at risk of not necessarily losing ground, but maybe perhaps becoming endangered?
Well, I think having a better knowledge of their life history dynamics and their environmental requirements is a good way for us to figure that out. And I think if you look at the paper by Fisicelli in talking about suitable habitats and his projections for the future based on the IPCC models, I think that's a good way to start looking at what kinds of things might become endangered because of climate change. I mean, obviously we can't know. We can't even know how the climate will change, and I keep hoping that we'll come up with some way to reduce our carbon emissions so that it doesn't get too much worse than it already is. But that is a way for us to look at what might happen. I wanted to mention too that if anyone would like me to get them some of the information that's on the literature cited list at the end of my talk, I'd be glad to help you find it if you can't. And the other thing is, if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. I think my email is listed somewhere on this talk. I meant to put that there. But anyway, I work for USGS, so you can find me.
Okay, I think with that there was a couple of more questions, and if you want to email Beth, you can get her email, or we will get those questions to her that if you had some burning questions that didn't get addressed. So I want you all to mark your calendars for the next 2 webinars in the SWS webinar series. Both the December and the January webinars are going to be presented at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And if you're interested in presenting requesting an SWS webinar or you have a topic of interest that you'd like to see us cover, please indicate that in the evaluation survey, or you can contact the SWS headquarters. And Beth, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to present our SWS webinar series. And thanks to our audience for attending today's webinar, and we look forward to your participation in the upcoming webinar on December 17th with Dr. Jan Kvet about wetlands and agriculture. Thanks again, Beth.
Okay, thanks. It was fun.